he had to make a choice. And either, he's an activist and a nonprofit and some sort of a charity, or he's really a for-profit business, a social enterprise, to truly show that it is possible to do this and change the industry from the inside out. Because if he doesn't prove that there is a way to do it better and that it's scalable for big companies to follow, then true change won't happen. And it'll be like a Band-Aid effect for a while to just pay some farmers more, but you can't reach all of them with charity. And it won't really change the underlying business model of the industry.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast,
a show where we, Paul Shapiro and Tony Okamoto,
spotlight companies making money by helping solve some of the world's most pressing problems. It's not every day that someone charges themselves with a crime, but that's exactly what the founder of a chocolate company that's just starting to get distribution throughout the US did. You may have seen their packaging popping up in the candy aisle, bright oranges and blues with massive text saying Tony's real big on it. But if you happen to try it out, before you even take a bite, pretty much right when you open the wrapper, you'll know it isn't an ordinary bar of chocolate.
Tony's Chocolonely makes it clear inside its packaging that this company exists for one sole reason: to end modern slavery in the cocoa industry. It was started by a Dutch journalist named Tony, who charged himself with the crime of being complicit in slavery simply by being a consumer of chocolate. Somehow he actually got in front of a judge in the Netherlands and brought former child slaves to testify against him and against the not-so-sweet side of the cocoa industry, what happens to kids in Africa who harvest the cocoa beans.
Tony may not have been convicted of a crime, but he did leave the courtroom with a conviction to try to end this dark practice by starting his own chocolate company that would try to guarantee that only free and fair labor was used to make his chocolate bars.
And as you'll hear in this interview, his company Tony's Chocolonely went from zero to the #1 chocolate bar in the Netherlands. And in 2015, the company started here in the US too, offering slavery-free chocolate that's quickly gaining popularity among Americans. And we're so fortunate to have the U.S. manager of Tony's with us on the show today, Michelle Wald, who, as you're about to find out, is a wealth of information not only about problems in the cocoa industry, but about how businesses can be part of the solution.
Michelle Wald, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We're so glad to have you, Michelle. All right. First and foremost, before we get to anything else, what does Tony's Chocolonely mean?
Tony's Chocolonely, it is quite a funny title. It was actually founded by a guy named Toon van de Koken. That's a Dutch name, but the international version of his name, which is easier for us Americans to pronounce, is Tony. And so Tony was lonely in the chocolate industry in his fight for ethically sourced, or we call slave-free chocolate. And so that's how we got to Tony's Chocolonely.
Huh, cool. Interesting. So we're going to talk a little bit about why Tony was so lonely and more about slavery and the modern world. But first, Michelle, just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that you worked for Nike for a long time. I actually recently read Phil Knight's book, Shoe Dog, which I thought was fantastic. I've recommended it on this podcast before and will recommend it again. And I know that they dealt with some of the same issues that you're now dealing with in the chocolate industry. But you were at Nike for a while. Why make the switch to chocolate?
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually had a few passions in my life, sweets and sports being two of them. And so in the sport,
you found the nexus.
Yeah, and they go hand in hand, actually, balance each other out. But yeah, working in the sports world for a long time was a great thing for me personally. I enjoyed helping make other people active. There was a mission to that company as well, and a lot of amazing experiences and great learnings as well at a big corporation. It also brought me around the world, which allowed me to go work at the European headquarters of Nike, which are based in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. And the amazing thing about that, in a small world connection sort of way, is that it linked me to Tony's, which is a Dutch company based in the Netherlands. And I discovered their purpose, their mission, their culture, and just their way of operating. And I was really, really impressed, as well as with the product itself. And so I kind of started over a couple of years of personal reflection, having thoughts of getting more into a really truly purpose-driven career path. And that brought me to Tony's, and I approached them directly, and we had some great conversations. And that's what led me to this job, actually moving back to the U.S. from Amsterdam and helping drive the U.S. operations.
That's really cool. I know that there are people listening who hear someone on our podcast or read an article online and feel really compelled to reach out. And so it's cool to know that you did that and it led to what you're doing now.
Exactly.
So, what's the problem with chocolate?
Yeah, well, no problem. It is delicious. I am a big fan of that. But the unfortunate part is that the supply chain of how it's made is really unequally divided, as we call it. And there are people being exploited to produce the chocolate that the rest of us in the Western world enjoy eating. Um, and it stems from basically poverty. The farmers who are picking the cocoa to put into these chocolate bars are simply not paid enough. And that's a kind of downward spiral because they don't have enough money to feed their families. It forces them to use, poor forms of labor, having children work under bad circumstances without being paid, and also having adults work under forced circumstances without being paid. And this exploitation is purely because they don't have enough money. So this leads to a lot of other problems that cycle around, but we really believe it stems from the poverty situation, which has just been exacerbated by the fact that in the cocoa industry for so long, it's been run by big corporations that are really interested in maximizing their profits and not seeing the full supply chain and what's happening at the front end.
Where is this happening?
So cocoa is grown around the equator, so all around anywhere where it's super warm, a little bit in South America, a little bit in Asia, but the majority of cocoa comes from West Africa. So about 60 to 70% of the world's cocoa supply comes from Ghana and Ivory Coast. And that's where the worst forms of what we call modern slavery and illegal child labor takes place. These are really small farms, not very industrialized, and that's why it takes so much manual labor to produce the cocoa from those farms.
So, Michelle, I recently had a bar of Tony's dark chocolate. It was delicious. My friend and business partner Adam Yee gave it to me, and I opened it. And inside of the package, it's all about slavery. The whole package is basically promotional materials about the evils of slavery and what Tony is doing to combat it. And it really struck me. That's what led me to reach out to you to talk about this. Not only is the company very mission driven, but it's the purpose of the company is not really just to make money. The purpose of this is to end slavery. And so my question for you is really, what do you mean by slavery? You know, when a lot of people think about slavery, they think about 150 years ago, racially based slavery, where the children of slaves were slaves and where there was this whole structure of white versus black. I know that's not necessarily what you're talking about. So, I've heard you use terms like illegal child labor and modern slavery. What's the difference between these terms?
Yeah, no, Paul, I'm glad you asked because it is really complicated to understand. Unfortunately, there is no international consensus or an aligned definition on slavery and modern slavery. So some companies and some organizations call it slavery, others call it forced labor, some say slave-like work. Some organizations include the worst forms of child labor, which are defined by the ILO, the International Labor Organization. Some only include human trafficking in their definition. I mean, the one thing that everybody agrees on in this industry is the existence of exploitation and forced labor, and the fact that it's unacceptable and it's illegal and it has to stop. So that's a common understanding, which is super important. We work at Tony's with the definitions that incorporate many of these different definitions by credible sources. So we include all forms of forced labor and exploitation, which includes those worst forms of child labor. So it's really we are okay with what's called child work, which is children that go to school and then after their school hours, they come home and they help their parents on the farm. They might pick up some cocoa beans, carry them to, a different area, whatever that might be. So long as it is not using dangerous machinery, machetes, dangerous chemicals and pesticides, carrying loads that are too heavy for them, that stimulate their growth and don't enable them to learn. Any other harsh conditions, and really the fact that if they're not allowed to go to school or if they're working in hours which prevent them from being awake enough to digest the information at school, that's what's called child labor or illegal child labor, and that is not okay. So that's the area where we're focusing on the most. And then the term modern slavery being more applied to adults and children alike that are, in the worst cases, trafficked and sold off without their voluntary consent, and worked under conditions where they can't leave. So bonded labor, if they don't have the choice to leave and they're not getting paid.
So how does it happen? Where did the children come from? Are they literally stolen from their families, or are they orphans? How does it happen?
Yeah, so it's not stolen typically. They are just misguided. They think, and there is a situation of poverty, and so people don't have enough money, and they think, oh, I'm going to go get paid. And so they are sold from their families or some. I'm not the complete expert myself, but there are instances where, yeah, it's unknown and they're taken without their consent. But sometimes they are taken around the age of 5 or 6, taken to these farms, worked really hard. And it's only once they're at the farms that they learn that they can't have communication with their families. They're not getting fed properly. They're definitely not getting paid. They're working crazy long hours under bad conditions. And then they're stuck. And so once they get there, it's like they have no way out and no recourse back to escape. And they're worked really hard until they get pretty much, I don't know, to the age of 15, 16, 17, where they're too big for a farmer to control. And they're left at the side of the road to fend for themselves. And at this point, they've been completely robbed of their childhood and their future because they've had no education and really not a lot of background to go from here.
If people are getting paid to do this work, how much would they be getting paid?
Well, the farmers in Ghana and Ivory Coast, I can speak for, that's 60, 70% of the cocoa supply, like I mentioned. The prices that they're getting are set by the local government. It's called the farm gate price. And for example, in Ivory Coast, the farm gate price changes every year, but this year it was set at $1.33 per kilogram. And that is based on what the local government deems, based on also the international cocoa price. Now, a farmer on average grows about 1,000 kilograms of cocoa, so that brings them a $1,300 income. Cocoa's not their only income, but it's about 70% of it. They've got about 6 family members. So if you do the math, that gives them 60 cents per person per day to live on. And the poverty line in that country of the Ivory Coast is set at $2.17 a day. So you can see that's far below the poverty line and definitely not enough to live off of. And so that's what they're working with. And we definitely applaud certifications like Fair Trade that pay a premium on top of that price to try and increase the income that the farmers make. However, that's just a first step, and it's definitely not enough to close that gap. So what we believe at Tony's and we do is pay an additional premium on top of that Fair Trade premium to close that gap to the living income and ensure that farmers can feed their families and thus send their kids to school.
Wow, that's so sad that people are getting paid so little.
Yeah.
How many children are suffering in these conditions?
Yeah, at the moment, what's been quantified by the let's call it credible resources to do this work, Tulane University is a big one of them, the Walk Free Foundation, they're estimating about 2.5 million farmers that work in Ghana and Ivory Coast and 2.3 million children working on those farms. About 90% of those children are working under illegal conditions. And the specific quantified number at the moment of the worst forms of human trafficking are 30,000. Now, we believe this number is definitely low. It's only what's been tracked in the kind of more accessible farms. However, about 5 years ago, there was a civil war in the country, and a lot of farmers fled out into the jungle, if you will, or the forest, and much harder places to get to. And so these kind of monitoring agencies aren't able to go in there and count that number. And we believe it to be almost double. So there's still a lot of unaccounted for illegal work going on. But the documented numbers are 2.3 million children and about 30,000 with the worst forms of illegal labor.
So, all right, Michelle, we've talked about the problem. I'm sure everybody can accept that child slavery, modern slavery, illegal labor, whatever you want to call it, is bad and should be eradicated. I'm sure that there are plenty of ways to try to combat this, but Tony decided that he was going to start a company. And it's a pretty interesting story about this, right? So tell us, how did he first end up launching this idea? What did he do?
Yeah. So it's funny, he's not a businessman by background. He is a journalist. And there's a food program on TV in the Netherlands, which translates generally to Food Unwrapped. And so they're discovering the secrets behind food and the marketing behind food. And he just was doing a segment on cocoa and came across some of this research that said that there was modern slavery in the cocoa industry. And he, it totally rang an alarm bell with him. And he tried to find out if this was true and what was happening. So he called up all the big chocolate companies to find out what was going on. They all acknowledge that this is definitely happening in the industry, but they, aren't doing anything about it at the time, have other priorities focused on mainly maximizing profits. And so he was really perturbed and was this aggressive journalist, and so decided to try and create big awareness to have consumers and retailers alike get put more pressure on this. So he tried to arrest himself. He ate a bunch of chocolate and called the police in Holland and said, "I'm a chocolate criminal. Come arrest me. I'm complicit in this because I know that there was criminal labor used in producing this chocolate, so I should be accountable." And he took this case to court. He brought in witnesses from West Africa to testify against him, former child slaves. And the judge basically said, morally, you are correct, but I can't arrest you because, first of all, everyone eats chocolate and I can't arrest everyone. But more so, the beans that those children picked, I can't trace them back to the bars you ate because cocoa is a mass balance product. It's not traceable. So all the beans, whether they're fair trade or not, just get put on one big pile, and that's where the traders buy from. So this was kind of an eye-opening moment for him, and he thought, okay, I need to do something differently about this. And there was actually a Willy Wonka film coming up at the time, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and he said, I want to put out some slave-free chocolate bars to drive awareness at this time of this movie launch. So he printed these bright red wrappers, alarming wrappers, around 5,000 chocolate bars that he had produced by, at the time, the fair trade chocolate supplier in the Netherlands, and called it Tony's Chocolonely for the reason we discussed. And it just sold out like crazy. Totally unexpected. He kind of started this business. And so it's definitely a social enterprise. Making money is not the end game of this business at all. It's just a means to the end of the mission of 100% slave-free chocolate.
Michelle, maybe you're not a Dutch legal expert, but I'm sure you know in the United States, if I wanted to arrest myself, I'm not going to get a hearing in court, right? Like I couldn't do that. So
Yeah.
How did he actually get a hearing before a judge? I mean, I think what he did is ingenious. It's fascinating. I'm totally impressed by it. But just legally speaking, how did he get the court's time?
He hired a really expensive lawyer and they pushed and pushed. He is a persistent guy. I don't know the details of the legal system in Holland, but we do have a 90-minute documentary which kind of goes through the whole story, and you can see it in there. You can see it happening.
Where can people find that documentary?
We are working to get it up on different platforms that are more easily accessible. As of right now, you can definitely email us at our mail us website at tonyschocolonely.com, and we will send a link. But we don't have it up totally available and easily searchable at the moment.
Editorial note: if you go to the show notes on the Business for Good podcast website for this particular episode, you can click directly on the link to watch this documentary.
You mentioned that the cocoa beans are mixed together. So if someone thinks they're buying fair trade, are they really not buying fair trade?
No, it's a great question. They are paying a fair trade premium, and that money through the fair trade organization will get to some cooperatives or farmers somewhere who have certified their farms as fair trade and gone through the proper requirements to do so. But those beans aren't actually the ones in the bar they're eating necessarily. So that's where it's different. And what we do at Tony's is have built traceability into the supply chain. So we actually can segregate our beans, keep them separate from the mass pile, keep them in different bags and trucks and everything. And they come into all the way from the farmer, through the co-op, through the traders, into the chocolate production area and into the bars. We know that those beans are coming from the farmers that we've built relationships with. And that's a truly different path, which is difficult to accomplish. But we've built a model that is called the Bean Tracker. We have a technological platform for that, and we open source it and encourage other companies to leverage it and use it in their own supply chains as well.
And I know the answer to this, but I just want to confirm with you, Michelle. The goal of Tony's is not just to differentiate itself from other chocolate companies. I mean, you want other chocolate companies to replicate what you're doing and completely copy your model, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is it's like there's two ways to make the entire world 100% slave-free chocolate. You either get 100% market share doing it yourself, or you inspire other companies to come along with you and follow the same business model and sourcing principles to ensure that their chocolate is also 100% slave-free. And that's definitely the path we're going down. So it's the more the merrier. Everyone get in on this board and follow suit.
And have you found any success in that? I mean, Tony's, I presume, is still a small player in the global chocolate industry, but have you found any success with the major chocolate makers for them going even closer to your direction so far?
Absolutely. So we are really excited about some recent progress, actually. Um, there are a couple of examples I'll speak to. One is Barry Callebaut, which is the biggest chocolate producer in the world, and that's where we produce Tony's chocolate. The reason we've chosen them as a partner is to show that this is a scalable model. We're not just a small company that's doing it in a small production facility, which big companies can't follow. This is actually the same place where other big companies are producing. So they've teamed up with us a few years ago and invested over $6 million of their own money to actually separate cocoa butter, which is the other main component in cocoa in chocolate, in addition to cocoa mass, that hadn't been traceable in the past. And they've invested in tanks to separate that along their production lines and flows as well, which shows their commitment to more direct traceability, and then thus you can pay the farmers that that came from more. So that was a huge advancement. And then just actually a couple weeks ago, the biggest grocery outlet, the biggest retailer in the Netherlands, called Albert Heijn, which are owned by Ahold, they have committed to following Tony's open chain, so these 5 sourcing principles, which I can speak to, in all of their private label chocolate. And so you can read a bit more about that in some recent articles in the New York Times and Forbes. But that is a massive agreement between Albert Heijn and Barry Callebaut, with Tony's guidance, to follow those sourcing principles in their private label brand, which is huge.
Are there people in your space who don't want those big companies to do to replicate your model? I know that Paul and I work in the plant-based world, and when big companies start making vegan products, there are a lot of naysayers. So do you see that at all in your field?
That's an interesting question. I mean, we definitely welcome criticism. We're very critical of ourselves and want to do things better. I haven't heard of that, and I can't imagine that there are problems with that. For example, in Holland, where Tony's has been around since 2005, so 13 years, lots of progress. They've become the number 1 chocolate brand now. And what it's done is actually have other chocolate brands follow suit. And now the consumers and the retailers are demanding more ethically sourced and slave-free chocolate, and that is becoming a bigger percentage of the total. We've expanded into the US to try and follow that model and that kind of progression in a much bigger marketplace and in the home of some of the biggest chocolate producers in the world, exactly to influence that. So I don't see any downside. I mean, people might talk about price. Does it cost more? If you look at our price compared to other prices out there, it is super competitive, especially per ounce, because our bars are just really big and chunky, which is also kind of a nice mouthfeel. But the incremental price it would cost to pay farmers fairly is not a huge impact on these big corporations. Sure, we'll have to take a look at the margins, and we set our profit margins very purposefully. We want to be fair and equal across everyone in the supply chain. So we don't want consumers to pay too much and overpay. We don't want farmers to get too little. And so what is that right profit that is fair for the role of a chocolate producer in the middle of that supply chain? And that's, I guess, the area that would have to be reviewed by the big chocolate companies and their stakeholders and their shareholders to ensure that everyone's aligned and doing this for the right reason.
So, Michelle, you just said something that really struck me. You said that Tony's is now the single largest chocolate bar player in the Dutch market, right? Did I hear you correctly? Correct.
Yep.
So I know that you entered the US, I think, in 2015. Am I right?
Yep.
So you're now in the US. It's a huge chocolate market. I'm super impressed that, the company has gone from non-existence to number 1 in the Netherlands. First, I want to ask you about that price issue that you mentioned. You said that it is super competitive, but just as a devil's advocate, like, how can that be? If you are paying a higher price for your cocoa beans for all the reasons that you've said, how can you be competitive on price? Like, where are you spending less money in order to be competitive, or is it not profitable? Like, are you selling at a loss?
No, we're not selling at a loss. In the U.S. currently, we are not profitable, but we have the parent company in the Netherlands, and we're in a growth phase. But as a total entity, and we are fully transparent in all of our numbers. We're still privately held, but everything is public, put out there in an annual report. I would encourage you to read it. We call it the annual fair report. All the numbers are there. We take a lower net margin at the bottom. So we're not making the same types of margins that the big chocolate players are, but we're taking enough to ensure financial stability and prove that it is possible to still make a profit and source ethically.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Why can't charities alone solve this problem? In other words, aren't charities out there doing similar work? And why did you guys, or why did Tone, I'm sorry, why did Tone decide to start a company?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when he discovered, as an investigative journalist, when he discovered this whole situation and issue, he knew that some change had to happen. He really felt passionate about this, as all of us who work at Tony's now do. But he decided that he had to make a choice, and either, he's an activist and a nonprofit and some sort of a charity, or he's really a for-profit business, a social enterprise, to truly show that it is possible to do this and change the industry from the inside out. Because if it's not, if he doesn't prove that there is a way to do it better, then, and that it's scalable for big companies to follow, then true change won't happen, and it'll be like a Band-Aid effect for a while to just pay some farmers more, but you can't reach all of them with charity, and it won't really change the underlying business model of the industry. And that's why he chose to go after a social enterprise.
Interesting. So one question that keeps coming into my mind, Michelle, is just this question about the feasibility of all of this. So I know that Tony's got sued by an incumbent chocolate maker saying it's impossible to determine that it's slave-free. And I mean, basically, how do you ensure that the laborers you're trying to help actually see the premium? So what chain is there to verify that those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in the cocoa industry are actually getting the premium that you're paying to the farmers?
Yeah. Well, we pay them directly. We've even done some kind of pilots with blockchain, going directly to the mobile phones of certain farmers and stuff. But we work with 5 cooperatives in Ghana and Ivory Coast. We build long-term relationships with them, minimum of 5 years, because that's how long it takes to grow a cocoa tree from a sapling. And if the farmers don't know where the income's coming from next year, they can't reinvest in their farm and grow their business. So we commit to these long-term relationships and pay those co-ops directly. And that money, how it's spent, is determined by the co-ops, which they have a board elected by the farmer members within there. We are on the ground. We have a team called Tony's Impact Team, which are 7 people that are on the ground in Ivory Coast and Ghana very regularly, every few weeks, working with these co-ops and farmers directly, building the relationship, treating everyone equally, building trust, and continuing to learn from each other both ways. It's not a one-way street. These farmers are very advanced and know what they need to do better. They know what's working, they know what's not working, and they share that with us, and we cooperate back and forth to ensure that they can meet the standards that we're trying to uphold in regards to 0 cases of modern slavery and illegal child labor. We're super critical of ourselves, and it does still happen, especially as we grow. We need to introduce new farmers and co-ops into our supply chain, and then you start from scratch, and the education process starts at the beginning. So we work with outside sources to monitor these acts of illegal child labor. If any are found, we work immediately to remediate them. There are very few at the moment in the Tony supply chain, but it still can happen, especially as we grow and work with more farmers. So we've chosen that path purposefully.
And you found that that's something that you need to monitor, not just in the cocoa industry, right? I was reading about the hazelnut issue that you had. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was actually brought to our attention, I believe, by consumers, which is fantastic, that, we were sourcing hazelnuts from an area that had also some bad labor practices. And we investigated, found out that was true, took full accountability for it, and have changed our sourcing. So now we're very self-critical on all of our inclusions, or the different ingredients that are included in the different flavors of chocolate, where every single piece is sourced from. And we make sure that we use fair trade where possible, and then where, if a product is not available via fair trade, we find and we assess all the labor practices to ensure that it's nothing illegal.
Michelle, can you tell us about the 5 principles you mentioned earlier?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the first one is traceability, like I talked about. We need to know where the beans come from to make sure that we can be accountable for them. So we don't buy from that big stack. We buy directly from relationships with farmers and co-ops. The second one is a higher price. So we talked about paying the Tony's premium. We calculate this each year, closing that gap between what the farmers are going to earn from the market price and what their living income is. The third one is these long-term relationships, committing to 5 years at least. The fourth one is about higher quality and productivity of cocoa. So working and investing in agricultural know-how to help the farmers increase their productivity, and also encouraging them to diversify their crops so that they're not heavily reliant on only cocoa. And then the fifth one is building strong farmers. So helping them professionalize into cooperatives. This improves obviously the resources, the tools they get to have better quality on their farms, and then also ensure that they have a louder voice together in negotiating price with different traders.
It sounds pretty comprehensive, at least as far as I can tell. Let me just get a little bit broader on you for a moment, Michelle, and maybe you're not familiar with public opinion in Western Africa, but for a very long time, in fact, most of recorded human history, slavery was considered normal and natural. So, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, they all had slaves. This was routinely used by defenders of slavery in the United States, that this was like a normal, natural state, that there was slavery in Africa long before there were European colonists in Africa enslaving Africans. And so my question for you is, those of us in the West, if you ask us today about slavery, virtually everyone will thankfully say it's a moral abomination. That wasn't the case, though, just a blink of an eye ago, historically speaking. Do you know what the public opinion on these issues is in countries like Ghana and elsewhere? Like, do they accept that, I don't want to say they as if there's a monolith, but is there as much acceptance that slavery is an abomination there as it is in the Western world?
What I know, and it's not comprehensive, but from what I've heard from the co-ops we work with and the governmental parties that we work with, they would like to portray Africa in a more positive light, in a more fair and equal light, which is the reality that there is tons of potential in these countries. They have a thriving entrepreneurial environment, and it's not just the poor slavery Africa that you're kind of referencing from the past. And so they don't want our charity. They just want to be treated equally and be taken out of anonymity. I can't pronounce that word, but not be anonymous anymore, right? Bring a personification to them, show what they're doing and the potential that they have. And so I think that's the angle we're trying to take, and work as equal partners rather than being, these external Western companies coming in and saying that we're saving the day. That's absolutely not the case. There's nothing to be saved. There's just fair treatment to be had all around.
Do you have any resources for entrepreneurs who are interested in this issue or any other issue that could be helpful to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from our side, like I said, the documentary is a great tool to learn a bit. And we also love to spread awareness and talk about this with anyone who's interested to hear. So happy to come and speak at different organizations or schools or conferences or whatever it might be. Please definitely invite us or just call us up or email us with any questions you have. There are tons of websites out there and organizations that are working towards the same cause. And so I would just encourage people to check those out.
Let's just say, though, Michelle, that there's an MBA student who's listening to this, and she or he is interested in maybe not dedicating their life to this issue, but to something else. As far as entrepreneurs who really want to make a difference for good in the world, or just entrepreneurs in general, are there any resources that you would suggest, whether maybe books that you've read or speeches you've heard, that you think would either offer inspiration or perhaps some guidance of things that they may want to embrace or pursue?
Oh, I gotcha. Man, I'm not sure that I'm the best to provide those resources. I've also had that entrepreneurial spirit myself for quite some time and haven't fully branched out on my own. And I was glad to get involved in this startup mode in terms of the U.S. expansion, but not fully out on my own. So no, I don't have any great tools for that.
Okay, that's all right. Well, I'll again recommend then your former boss, Phil Knight's book, Shoe Dog, because...
I really enjoyed that one too.
Yeah, it was
powerful.
Really...
Also, can you tell us where people can find all the information about your chocolate company?
Absolutely. I mean, it's all on our website, tonyschocolonely.com. And from there, you've got the whole history of how it started, all of the activations we're doing now to change the industry. And, we've got the typical social handles as well, which people can follow to stay up to date more real time. we do have a few books, but they are in Dutch, so it's not that accessible at the moment for the U.S. audience. But we also partner with a lot of other great organizations and put out some stories, bringing to life those farmers in Africa that we work with. There's a great exhibition or exhibit called Bitter Stories. So that's available online as well. You can see the life and the story of certain farmers. And there'll be a new exhibit coming out really soon called Reframed, which was a great partnership with an American Ghanaian photographer in New York named Joshua Kasi. And he has also brought to life and personified a lot of the farmers in West Africa. So these are some other great tools and ways to learn about what's going on in the industry.
Great. Thanks so much. So as we wind down here, Michelle, one of the things that we always ask our guests to conclude with is to offer any thoughts about what you may be grateful in the world for. So there's many things to be grateful for, but we'd love to know, Michelle, what makes you grateful?
I am absolutely grateful for good people and positivity and optimism. And I feel like I have been fortunate to kind of follow an opportunistic path of just going where the stars align a little bit. I'm not very spiritual, but it feels like a lot of connection points have just been happening organically. And that makes me really happy and surrounded by just people who have super positive intentions. And that's what Tony's is all about as well. So I feel like my personal life and my work life have combined right now. And it just feels good.
Great. Well, it definitely feels good to eat Tony's chocolate. We really liked the dark chocolate, and we'll certainly be eating more of it after this interview, I can assure you.
Yeah, actually, we saw ours at REI, but can you tell us where else in the U.S. people can buy it?
Absolutely. So nationwide, you've got Cost Plus, World Market, Whole Foods, indeed REI. And then kind of a lot of regional chains like New Seasons in the Pacific Northwest is a big player. We've got the Fresh Market in the East, and pretty much like any of your natural co-ops, local grocers, those kind of stores in the more natural zone where consumers are a bit more concerned where their products come from. That's where you'll find us distributed as of today. And then we're at that transition point now, breaking more into the conventional grocery space to become more accessible for consumers who shop in more conventional grocery stores. So we'll start popping up in those spaces soon as well.
And finally, Michelle, I promised my friend Joanna that I would ask you this. Are there any plans for an even darker version? So I think 70 or 71% cocoa is your highest, but what about going higher for Joanna?
We are definitely working on that. It will take some time, but yeah, we try to as well follow the trends in the U.S. and we know that there's a lot of other interesting ideas out there.
Very cool. All right. Well, Michelle Wald, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Have a sweet day.
All right, folks. Thanks so much for listening to the show.
We hope you got a lot out of it and that you will show us some love. You can rate Business for Good as 5 stars on iTunes, support us on Patreon, and tell your friends interested in business or really just in making the world a better place about the show.
And we'd love to hear what you're thinking. Please feel free to contact us anytime via our website, businessforgoodpodcast.com.
And as always, we hope that you will be in the business of doing good.